The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the small medical outpost in Afghanistan. Dr. Sarah Mitchell wiped the sweat from her forehead as she finished stitching up another wounded soldier. The makeshift hospital tent was filled with the sounds of pain and urgent whispers from medical staff, rushing between patients. Sarah had been working in this remote location for 8 months now. At 28, she was one of the youngest trauma surgeons to volunteer for deployment in such a dangerous area. Her colleagues back home thought she was crazy for leaving her comfortable position at Boston General Hospital. But Sarah felt called to serve where she was needed most. The radio crackled to life, interrupting her thoughts. "Incoming wounded! Multiple casualties. 8 to 5 minutes." The voice was urgent and strained. Sarah immediately began preparing for the influx of patients. She had learned to work fast in these situations. Every second counted when lives hung in the balance. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she gathered supplies and cleared space on the operating tables. The sound of helicopter rotors grew louder, and soon the medical team was rushing outside to meet the incoming aircraft. The scene that greeted them was chaos. Soldiers were carrying their wounded comrades, shouting instructions over the noise of the helicopter engines. Among the injured was a man who immediately caught Sarah's attention. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair matted with blood. Despite his obvious pain, he was still trying to give orders to his team, refusing to be carried on a stretcher. "Sir, you need medical attention now," one of the medics shouted over the noise. "Take care of my men first," the wounded man replied firmly, his voice carrying authority even in his weakened state. Sarah quickly assessed the situation. This man was clearly the leader of the group, and from his uniform she could tell he was a Navy SEAL commander. But he was also bleeding heavily from a shrapnel wound in his shoulder and had obvious signs of a concussion. Without hesitation, Sarah approached him. "Commander, I'm Dr. Mitchell. Your men are being taken care of, but right now I need to treat you. You're losing too much blood." The commander looked at her with intense blue eyes. Even through his pain, she could see the intelligence and determination that had probably made him an effective leader. "My team comes first, Doc. Your team needs their commander alive," Sarah replied firmly. "Let me do my job so you can get back to doing yours." Something in her tone must have convinced him, because he finally allowed the medics to help him onto a stretcher. As they wheeled him into the medical tent, Sarah could hear explosions in the distance. The enemy was still active in the area, making their situation even more dangerous. Inside the tent, Sarah quickly began working on the commander's wounds. The shrapnel had missed major arteries, but the bleeding was severe. As she worked, she could hear him giving status reports to his radio operator, even while lying on the operating table. "Commander Jackson reporting. Mission partially completed. Need extraction for wounded personnel." He spoke into the radio held by one of his men. So his name was Jackson, Sarah noted mentally as she continued her work. She had treated many soldiers over the months, but there was something different about this one. Maybe it was his calm demeanor under pressure, or the way his men looked to him for guidance even while he was injured. As Sarah cleaned and stitched his wounds, Commander Jackson remained conscious and alert. Despite the pain medication, he kept asking about his team members and the status of their mission. It was clear that leadership came naturally to him, even in the most difficult circumstances. "Doc, how are my men doing?" he asked as Sarah finished bandaging his shoulder. "They're going to be fine," Sarah replied truthfully. "You got them out of whatever situation you were in before it became fatal for any of them." Jackson nodded, some of the tension leaving his face. "Good, that's what matters." Just then the ground shook violently. Explosions were getting closer to their position. Sarah looked up from her work, concern evident on her face. This wasn't unusual in their location, but the intensity suggested a serious attack was underway. A soldier burst into the tent. "Doc, we need to evacuate. Enemy forces are advancing on our position. We have maybe 10 minutes before they're in range to overrun us." Sarah's heart raced, but her training kicked in. She quickly assessed which patients could be moved safely and which ones were too critical to transport. Commander Jackson was stable enough to travel, but some of the other wounded soldiers were not. "I'm not leaving without all my men," Jackson said, trying to sit up despite Sarah's protests. "Commander, you're in no condition to fight," Sarah said firmly, "and some of these patients can't be moved safely right now." The sound of gunfire was getting closer. Through the tent opening, Sarah could see soldiers taking defensive positions around the medical facility. The situation was becoming desperate quickly. Jackson looked at Sarah with those intense blue eyes again. "Doc, you need to evacuate with the mobile patients. I'll stay here with whoever can't be moved." "Absolutely not," Sarah replied without hesitation. "You're my patient and I'm not leaving you or anyone else behind." The commander stared at her in surprise. Most people didn't argue with him, especially not in a combat situation. But this young doctor seemed determined to stand her ground, even with enemy forces approaching. "This isn't up for debate. Doc, your safety is more important than—" "My safety is my decision," Sarah interrupted. "I became a doctor to save lives, not to run away when things get dangerous. These men need medical care, and I'm staying to provide it." Jackson realized he was dealing with someone as stubborn and dedicated as himself. Despite the serious situation, he found himself almost smiling at her determination. The explosions were getting closer now, and Sarah could hear the distinctive sound of automatic weapons fire. Whatever was happening outside, it was clear that evacuation was no longer an option. They would have to defend their position and hope for the best. Sarah made her decision. She would stay with her patients and do whatever it took to keep them alive, even if it meant putting herself in danger. She had no idea that this choice would change the course of her life forever. The enemy fire intensified as Sarah continued working on her patients. Commander Jackson had managed to sit up despite his injuries and was coordinating with the soldiers defending their position through his radio. His shoulder was bandaged, but Sarah could see blood seeping through the gauze. "Commander, you need to lie down. You're reopening your wounds," Sarah said while checking on another patient. "Not happening, Doc. My men are out there fighting and I'm not going to lie here helpless," Jackson replied, his jaw set with determination. Through the tent walls, Sarah could hear the battle raging outside. Bullets whistled overhead and the sound of explosions grew more frequent. The medical tent, marked with red crosses, was supposed to be off-limits to enemy fire, but in this remote area, such rules often didn't apply. One of Jackson's men, a young soldier named Martinez, rushed into the tent. "Sir, we're outnumbered 3-1. Lieutenant Davis requests permission to call in air support." Jackson nodded grimly. "Tell Davis to make the call." "And Martinez, how many wounded do we have who can still fight?" "5 men are walking wounded, sir. They're insisting on staying in the fight." Sarah looked up from her patient. "Those men need medical attention, not combat duty." "With respect, Doc, we need every man we can get right now," Jackson replied. "Sometimes you have to choose between perfect medical care and staying alive." Before Sarah could respond, a massive explosion rocked the entire compound. The force knocked her to the ground, and several pieces of medical equipment crashed down around them. When the ringing in her ears subsided, she could hear someone screaming for help outside. That sounded like a direct hit on the communications building, Martinez reported, his face pale. Jackson tried to stand up, but Sarah firmly pushed him back down. "You're not going anywhere. Your shoulder is bleeding again, and you probably have a concussion. Doc, if our communications are down, we can't call for backup or air support. We're sitting ducks out here." Sarah realized the gravity of their situation. Without communication, they couldn't request evacuation or reinforcements. They were truly on their own in hostile territory with multiple wounded soldiers who couldn't be moved. Another soldier burst into the tent. "Sir, Sergeant Williams is down bad. Shrapnel to the chest. He needs immediate surgery or he's not going to make it." Sarah's medical training took over. "Bring him in here immediately. Clear that table and get me more light." As the soldiers carried in Sergeant Williams, Sarah could see that his injuries were severe. The shrapnel had punctured his lung and he was struggling to breathe. This was exactly the kind of emergency surgery she had trained for, but performing it under enemy fire was something entirely different. "Commander Jackson, I need you to help me," Sarah said as she prepared for surgery. "Doc, I don't know anything about medical procedures." "You don't need to. I just need steady hands to hold instruments and follow my instructions exactly. Your men are depending on us both right now." Jackson nodded and moved to the operating table despite his own injuries. Sarah quickly explained what she needed him to do as she began working on Sergeant Williams. The sound of gunfire continued outside, but both she and Jackson focused entirely on the task at hand. "Hold this retractor steady," Sarah instructed. "I need to see exactly where the shrapnel entered." Jackson's hands were remarkably steady for someone who had been injured and was in a combat situation. As Sarah worked, she found herself impressed by his ability to follow her instructions and stay calm under pressure. "You're good at this," she commented as she carefully removed a piece of shrapnel from William's chest cavity. Navy training teaches you to stay calm in crisis situations, Jackson replied. Though I have to admit surgery wasn't part of my curriculum. Despite the danger around them, Sarah found herself almost smiling. There was something reassuring about working with someone who could stay focused and reliable, no matter what was happening. The surgery took nearly an hour, with enemy fire continuing sporadically outside. Several times explosions nearby caused the tent to shake, but both Sarah and Jackson maintained their concentration. Finally, Sarah was able to repair the damage to Williams's lung and stabilize his condition. "Is he going to make it?" Jackson asked as they finished bandaging the sergeant. "If we can get him to a proper hospital facility within the next few hours, yes. But he needs blood transfusions and monitoring that I can't provide here." Jackson's expression grew more serious. "Doc, I have to tell you something. Our extraction team was supposed to pick us up 6 hours ago. The fact that they haven't shown up, combined with our communications being down, suggests that something has gone seriously wrong." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert evening air. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means we might be here for a while. Maybe days, and the enemy knows where we are." The reality of their situation began to sink in. They had multiple wounded soldiers, limited medical supplies, no communication with the outside world, and hostile forces in the area. Sarah had volunteered for a dangerous assignment, but nothing had prepared her for being completely cut off from support. "Commander, what are our options?" she asked quietly. Jackson was silent for a moment, clearly weighing their choices. "We can try to move the wounded who are stable enough and attempt to reach a safer location. But that would mean leaving behind the soldiers who can't be moved, including Williams here." "That's not an option," Sarah said immediately. "I was hoping you'd say that," Jackson replied with a slight smile. "The alternative is to fortify our position here and hold out until help arrives, or we can re-establish communication." "How long can we hold this position?" "With the men I have and our current ammunition supplies, maybe 24 to 48 hours if the enemy doesn't mount a major assault." Sarah looked around at her patients. Some were stable, others were critical, but all of them were depending on her to keep them alive. She had come to Afghanistan to help wounded soldiers, and she wasn't about to abandon them now. "Then we stay and fight," she said with determination. Jackson studied her face carefully. "Doc, you understand what you're signing up for here? This isn't going to be easy, and there's no guarantee we'll make it out." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Commander, these men put their lives on the line for their country. The least I can do is put my life on the line for them." For the first time since she had met him, Jackson's stern expression softened slightly. "You know, Doc, I think you might be tougher than some of my SEALs." As night fell over the desert compound, Sarah prepared for what could be the longest and most dangerous night of her life. She had no idea that her decision to stay would not only save lives, but also begin a connection with Commander Jackson that would last far beyond this battlefield. The night brought an eerie quiet to the compound, broken only by the occasional distant sound of vehicles and the groans of wounded soldiers. Sarah moved between her patients, checking vital signs and administering pain medication from their dwindling supplies. Commander Jackson had positioned himself near the tent entrance, despite her repeated protests about his injuries. "Commander, you need rest. Your body is trying to heal," Sarah whispered as she approached him with a fresh bandage for his shoulder. "Can't sleep when my men are on watch," he replied quietly. "Besides, someone needs to coordinate our defenses." Sarah began changing his bandage, noting that the bleeding had finally stopped. In the dim light of the medical tent, she could see the exhaustion in his eyes, but also the unwavering determination that seemed to define him. "Tell me about yourself, Doc," Jackson said suddenly. "What made you volunteer for this assignment?" Sarah was surprised by the personal question. "Why do you want to know?" "Because you're risking your life for strangers in a foreign country, and I'm trying to understand what kind of person does that." As Sarah worked on his bandage, she found herself opening up. "My brother was killed in Iraq 3 years ago. He was a Marine. After he died, I realized I wanted to use my skills to help soldiers like him come home safely." Jackson was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry about your brother." "What was his name?" "Michael. Michael Thompson. He was only 22. He would be proud of what you're doing here," Jackson said softly. Before Sarah could respond, Martinez appeared at the tent entrance. "Sir, We've got movement about 200 yards out. Looks like they're setting up for another attack. Jackson immediately became all business again. How many men do we have on the perimeter? 8 walking wounded, plus the 5 who weren't injured in the initial attack. Everyone else is too hurt to fight effectively. Sarah listened to their conversation with growing concern. 13 men against an unknown number of enemy fighters, and several of those 13 were injured. The mathematics didn't look good. What about weapons and ammunition? Jackson asked. We're down to about 40% of our original supplies. If they mount a sustained attack, we'll run out pretty quickly. Jackson nodded grimly. Tell the men to conserve ammunition. Only shoot when they have clear targets. And Martinez, set up the wounded who can handle a weapon inside the medical tent. If they breach our perimeter, we'll need every gun we can get. After Martinez left, Sarah looked at Jackson with alarm. You're talking about turning my medical facility into a combat zone. Doc, if they overrun our position, the distinction between medical facility and combat zone won't matter. They'll kill everyone here, wounded or not. The harsh reality of their situation hit Sarah fully. She had known the assignment was dangerous, but she had always assumed that medical personnel would be relatively protected. Now she realized how naive that assumption had been. What do you need me to do? She asked. Jackson looked surprised. You've done enough already. Just keep taking care of the wounded. Commander, if we're all in this together, then I need to do more than just medical work. I can shoot a gun if necessary. Have you ever shot at another human being, Doc? Sarah hesitated. No, but I'm willing to learn if it means protecting my patients. Jackson studied her face in the dim light. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. But if it does, stay close to me and do exactly what I tell you. Over the next few hours, Jackson organized their defenses as best he could with limited resources. The wounded soldiers who could still fight were positioned at strategic points around the compound. Sarah continued her medical duties, but also helped distribute ammunition and water to the defenders. As dawn approached, the attack came without warning. The first explosion shattered the relative quiet of the early morning, followed immediately by automatic weapons fire from multiple directions. Sarah dropped to the ground as bullets began hitting the medical tent. They're coming from the north and east sides, someone shouted over the noise. Jackson grabbed his rifle and moved toward the tent opening. Doc, stay down and keep working on the wounded. We'll hold them off. But the attack was more intense than any of them had expected. Within minutes, it became clear that the enemy forces were trying to overrun their position completely. Sarah could hear Jackson coordinating the defense over the radio, his calm voice cutting through the chaos. Fall back to the medical tent. Tighten the perimeter, he ordered. Soon, wounded soldiers were being carried back into Sarah's area, adding to her patient load. She worked frantically to stop bleeding and stabilize injuries while the battle raged around her. The sound of gunfire was now coming from just outside the tent walls. Doc, we need to move the critical patients to the back of the tent, Jackson called out as he returned from the fighting, his uniform torn and dirty. Sarah looked around at her patients. Several were too critical to move, including Sergeant Williams, who was still unconscious from his surgery. I can't move Williams or Thompson. They won't survive being relocated. Then we make our stand here, Jackson said firmly. The enemy forces pressed their attack, and soon Sarah could hear fighting right outside the medical tent. Jackson positioned himself directly between the tent entrance and her patients, determined to protect them at all costs. Then the unthinkable happened. Enemy soldiers breached their perimeter and burst into the medical tent, weapons raised. Sarah found herself face to face with armed men who clearly had no intention of respecting the medical facility's protected status. Jackson immediately opened fire, taking down 2 of the intruders, but more kept coming. In the chaos that followed, Sarah saw Jackson take another hit, this time in his leg. He stumbled but kept fighting, refusing to go down. Without thinking, Sarah grabbed a scalpel from her surgical tray. When one of the enemy soldiers turned his weapon toward the wounded patients, she acted on pure instinct. She lunged forward and drove the scalpel into the man's arm, causing him to drop his rifle. The soldier turned toward Sarah with rage in his eyes, raising his sidearm. Sarah closed her eyes, knowing she was about to die, but the shot never came. Instead, she heard Jackson's voice. Nobody threatens my doctor. When Sarah opened her eyes, Jackson was standing over the fallen enemy soldier, despite his multiple wounds. He had saved her life, just as she had been trying to save his and his men's lives. The attack lasted another hour before the enemy forces finally withdrew. When the shooting stopped, Sarah found herself sitting on the ground, shaking from adrenaline and shock. She had just experienced combat firsthand, and she had taken action to defend her patients. Jackson collapsed beside her, his new leg wound bleeding heavily. "Doc, are you okay?" he asked, his voice weak from blood loss. "I should be asking you that question," Sarah replied as she immediately began working on his leg wound. "You've been shot twice now, and you're still trying to take care of everyone else." "It's my job," Jackson said simply. As Sarah treated his wounds, she realized that something fundamental had changed during the battle. She was no longer just a doctor treating a patient. She and Jackson had fought side by side to protect innocent lives, and that shared experience had created a bond between them that went far beyond the professional relationship they had started with. The rescue helicopters finally arrived 18 hours after the last attack ended. Sarah had spent that time working non-stop on the wounded, including Commander Jackson, whose leg wound had become infected despite her best efforts. When she heard the familiar sound of approaching aircraft, she felt a wave of relief that nearly brought her to tears. "That's our ride out of here, Doc," Jackson said weakly from his stretcher. The infection and blood loss had left him pale and feverish, but his eyes still held that determined spark. As the medical evacuation team loaded the wounded onto helicopters, Sarah found herself reluctant to leave. This compound had been the site of the most terrifying and challenging experience of her life, but it had also shown her what she was truly capable of under pressure. "Dr. Mitchell, you're coming with us on this bird," the lead medic said as he approached her. "I need to stay with the critical patients," Sarah replied automatically. "Ma'am, you've been treating wounded soldiers for over 36 hours straight. You need medical evaluation yourself and rest." Sarah looked down at herself and realized the medic was right. Her surgical scrubs were torn and stained with blood. Her hands were shaking from exhaustion, and she could barely remember the last time she had eaten or slept. Commander Jackson reached out and gently touched her arm. "Doc, you've done more than enough. Let someone else take care of things for a while." The helicopter ride to the main medical facility was a blur for Sarah. She dozed fitfully, waking periodically to check on the patients around her. Even in her exhausted state, her medical training kept her alert to any changes in their conditions. At the hospital, Sarah was immediately taken for her own medical evaluation, while Jackson and the other wounded soldiers were rushed into surgery and intensive care. The examining physician found that she was severely dehydrated and exhausted, but otherwise unharmed. "Dr. Mitchell, you need at least 48 hours of rest before you return to duty," the doctor told her firmly. But Sarah couldn't rest knowing that her patients were still fighting for their lives. Against medical advice, she found her way to the intensive care unit, where Jackson and the others were recovering. She found Jackson awake in his hospital bed, his leg elevated and connected to an IV drip of antibiotics. When he saw her, his face lit up with a smile that transformed his usually serious expression. "Shouldn't you be sleeping, Doc?" he asked. "Shouldn't you be following your doctor's orders too?" she replied, noting that he was trying to sit up despite his injuries. "Touché. How are my men doing?" Sarah pulled up a chair beside his bed. "Williams came through his surgery beautifully. The doctors say he'll make a full recovery. Martinez has some nerve damage in his arm, but it should heal with physical therapy. Everyone else is stable." Jackson closed his eyes in relief. "Thank God. I was so worried about Williams especially. He owes his life to you, you know. If you hadn't helped me with that surgery under fire, he wouldn't have survived. We make a good team," Doc, Jackson said quietly. For the next few days, Sarah divided her time between her official duties at the hospital and visiting Jackson during his recovery. She told herself it was just professional concern for a former patient, but she knew that wasn't entirely true. The intensity of their shared experience had created a connection that she couldn't easily dismiss. Jackson was recovering faster than expected, his natural physical conditioning helping him heal quickly. But Sarah could see that he was restless and eager to return to his unit. "The doctors say I should be cleared for light duty in another week," he told her during one of her visits, "and then you'll go back to dangerous missions in hostile territory," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice neutral. Jackson studied her face carefully. "Does that worry you?" Sarah hesitated before answering. "It's not my place to worry about what you do after you leave here." "That's not what I asked." "Yes, it worries me," Sarah admitted. "I've seen how you put yourself at risk for your men. That kind of leadership comes with a price." Someone has to do the job, Doc, and I'm good at it. I know you are. That's what makes it even more concerning. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Jackson spoke again. What about you? Will you finish your deployment here? I have 4 more months left. After that, I'm supposed to return to Boston General Hospital. Supposed to? Sarah sighed. I'm not sure civilian medicine is going to feel the same after this experience. Treating routine illnesses and injuries seems almost trivial compared to what we went through at that compound. You saved lives under impossible conditions. Sarah, that's what medicine is really about, isn't it? It was the first time he had used her first name, and hearing it from him sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. Over the following weeks, as Jackson completed his recovery, they found themselves spending more and more time together. What started as doctor-patient visits became genuine friendship as they talked about their experiences, their fears, and their hopes for the future. Jackson told her about growing up in rural Montana, how he had joined the Navy to see the world, and how he had worked his way up to become a SEAL commander. Sarah shared stories about her medical training, her decision to specialize in trauma surgery, and her struggle to deal with her brother's death. You know, Sarah, I've been thinking about what you said about civilian medicine feeling trivial after this deployment, Jackson said one evening as they walked around the hospital grounds. What about it? Maybe the answer isn't to go back to exactly what you were doing before. Maybe this experience is supposed to change your direction. What do you mean? Jackson stopped walking and turned to face her. There are programs that place trauma surgeons with military units on a more permanent basis. You could continue doing the kind of work you've discovered you're good at. Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. Are you suggesting I should make a career out of battlefield medicine? I'm suggesting you should consider it. The military needs doctors like you, doctors who can stay calm under fire and make life or death decisions in impossible situations. And what about you? Where does your career take you next? Jackson was quiet for a long moment. I have orders for another deployment in 6 months. Different theater, different mission, but probably just as dangerous. The reality of their situation began to sink in for Sarah. They were both military personnel with separate careers and separate futures. Their time together at this hospital was temporary, and soon they would return to their respective duties in different parts of the world. Jackson, I need to tell you something, Sarah said suddenly. What is it? What happened between us at that compound? The way we worked together and trusted each other? I've never experienced anything like that before. Jackson's expression grew serious. Neither have I. I don't know what that means for us or if it means anything at all. But I wanted you to know. Jackson reached out and gently took her hand. Sarah, in my line of work, I can't afford to get attached to people. It makes the job too difficult and too dangerous. Sarah felt her heart sink, but Jackson wasn't finished. But you've made me question whether that's really the right way to live. Maybe some attachments are worth the risk. As they stood there in the warm evening air, both of them realized that their lives had been fundamentally changed by their experience together. Neither of them knew what the future would hold, but they both knew that what they had found together was too important to simply walk away from. 3 years had passed since that night in Afghanistan when Sarah and Jackson had acknowledged their feelings for each other. 3 years of separation, sporadic communication, and the constant worry that came with loving someone in a dangerous profession. Sarah had taken Jackson's advice and applied for a permanent position as a trauma surgeon with military units. She was now stationed at a naval medical facility in San Diego, where she treated injured service members and occasionally deployed with special operations teams when medical support was needed in the field. Jackson had completed 2 more deployments since Afghanistan, each one taking him to remote and dangerous locations around the world. Their relationship had survived on stolen phone calls, brief emails when communication was possible, and rare meetings when their schedules aligned. It wasn't the kind of relationship either of them had imagined having, but it worked for them. They both understood the demands of military service and the sacrifices required to do their jobs effectively. More importantly, they had both learned that the connection they shared was strong enough to survive the challenges of distance and danger. Sarah was finishing her shift at the San Diego Medical Center when her phone rang. The caller ID showed Jackson's number, which always made her heart skip a beat because his calls were so unpredictable. Hey, stranger, she answered, unable to keep the smile out of her voice. Hey yourself. Doc, how's the day treating you? Just finished a 12-hour surgery on a pilot who crashed during a training exercise. He's going to be fine, but it was touch and go for a while. How about you? Where are you calling from this time? Actually, I'm about 20 minutes away from your hospital. Sarah nearly dropped her phone. What, you're here? In San Diego? Just got back from deployment yesterday. I have a week of leave before I have to report for my next assignment. Jackson, why didn't you tell me you were coming back? I wanted to surprise you. Are you free for dinner tonight? Sarah looked around the hospital, mentally calculating her responsibilities. I'm free right now. I'll meet you in the parking lot. She had seen Jackson only twice in the past 3 years, and each reunion had been bittersweet because they both knew it would be followed by another long separation. But this time felt different somehow, though she couldn't put her finger on why. When she walked out to the parking lot, she saw Jackson leaning against a rental car, wearing civilian clothes instead of his usual military uniform. He looked older and more weathered than she remembered, but his smile was the same one that had captured her attention during those long nights in Afghanistan. You look good. Doc, he said as he hugged her tightly. You look tired, she replied, studying his face with her medical training automatically kicking in. How long has it been since you've had a real break? Too long, but I'm here now, and that's what matters. They drove to a quiet restaurant overlooking the harbor where they could talk without interruption. Over dinner, Jackson told her about his latest deployment, though he couldn't share many details due to security classifications. Sarah updated him on her work at the medical center and some of the challenging cases she had handled. Sarah, I need to tell you something, Jackson said as they finished their meal. That sounds serious. It is. I've been offered a promotion to full colonel and a position at the Pentagon. It would mean no more field deployments, no more dangerous missions. A normal schedule, a normal life. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Jackson, that's wonderful. You've earned it after everything you've done. There's more. The position comes with a permanent assignment to the Washington, D.C. area. I would be there for at least the next 5 years, maybe longer. And you're telling me this because... Jackson reached across the table and took her hand. Because I want to know if you would consider requesting a transfer to Walter Reed Medical Center. They need trauma surgeons there, and your experience with military medicine would make you a perfect candidate. Sarah stared at him in surprise. You're asking me to move across the country to be near you? I'm asking you to consider it. I know it's a big decision, and I know your career is important to you. But Sarah, I'm tired of our relationship being conducted through phone calls and emails. I want to build something real with you. Sarah's mind raced as she considered the implications of what he was suggesting. Moving to Washington would mean leaving the position she had worked hard to establish in San Diego. It would mean starting over in a new hospital with new colleagues and new challenges. But it would also mean being with Jackson on a regular basis for the first time since they had met. It would mean having the chance to explore what their relationship could become without the constant pressure of separation and deployment schedules. What about your career? Sarah asked. Are you sure you want to give up field operations? That's been your life for so long. Jackson was quiet for a moment before answering. I've been thinking about that a lot during this last deployment. I've spent 15 years putting my life on the line for my country, and I'm proud of that service. But I'm also 35 years old and I'm starting to think about what comes next. And what comes next involves me? If you're willing, yes. Sarah, what we found together in Afghanistan was special. I've never met anyone else who could stand with me in the worst possible circumstances, and not only hold their ground but actually make me a better leader and a better man. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. Jackson, I've been thinking about the same things. These 3 years have been the hardest of my life, not because of the work, but because of missing you constantly. So what do you think? Would you consider making the move? Sarah squeezed his hand. I don't need to consider it. Yes, I'll request the transfer to Walter Reed. If they'll have me, I want to be there. Jackson's face broke into the biggest smile she had ever seen from him. Really, just like that? Just like that. Jackson, I realized something during this last deployment separation. I can be a good doctor anywhere, but I can only be truly happy with you. They spent the rest of the evening talking about their plans, their hopes for the future, and what it would mean to finally build a life together. For the first time in 3 years, Sarah felt like she could see a clear path forward that included both her career and the man she loved. The transfer process took 6 months to complete, but Sarah finally arrived in Washington, D.C. on a crisp October morning. Jackson met her at the airport, and as they drove through the city toward her new apartment, Sarah felt a sense of excitement and nervousness about this new chapter in their lives. Walter Reed Medical Center was impressive and challenging in ways that Sarah hadn't expected. The facility treated some of the most seriously wounded service members from around the world, and the medical staff was among the most skilled she had ever worked with. Jackson's new position at the Pentagon kept him busy, but for the first time since they had met, they were able to see each other regularly. They had dinner together several times a week, went to movies and concerts, and slowly began building the normal relationship they had both longed for. But the transition wasn't without its challenges. Both Sarah and Jackson had spent years being completely independent and self-reliant. Learning to share their lives and make decisions together required adjustment and patience from both of them. 6 months after Sarah's arrival in Washington, Jackson was called away for a 2-week training exercise. Even though it was much shorter than his previous deployments, Sarah found herself worrying constantly about his safety. "I thought this Pentagon job meant no more dangerous assignments," she said when he called her from the training facility. "It's just training, Sarah. I'm perfectly safe." "I know, but I can't help worrying. I think I got too used to being afraid for you during those long deployments." "Hey, listen to me," Jackson said gently. "I understand that fear, because I feel the same way about you when you're treating critical patients or when you get called in for emergency surgeries. But we can't let that fear control our lives." Sarah realized he was right. They had both chosen careers that involved risk and danger, and they had to trust each other to be careful and competent in their respective jobs. When Jackson returned from his training, he seemed different somehow. More relaxed, more settled, but also more determined about something that he wasn't sharing with her. "Sarah, there's something I want to talk to you about," he said one evening as they walked along the Potomac River. "What is it?" Jackson stopped walking and turned to face her. "I've been thinking a lot about our future, about what we want our lives to look like. And what conclusion have you reached?" Instead of answering with words, Jackson dropped to one knee and pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. Sarah's heart stopped as she realized what was happening. "Sarah Mitchell, you saved my life in Afghanistan, but more than that, you showed me what it means to have a true partner. You're brave, compassionate, brilliant, and stubborn, enough to argue with a SEAL commander when you think he's wrong." Sarah laughed through the tears that were now streaming down her face. "I love you, more than I ever thought it was possible to love another person. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Sarah whispered, then louder. "Yes, of course I'll marry you." As Jackson slipped the ring onto her finger, Sarah realized that their journey from that battlefield in Afghanistan to this moment on the banks of the Potomac had been worth every challenge, every separation, and every moment of fear they had endured. The wedding planning took 8 months, partly because both Sarah and Jackson wanted something meaningful rather than elaborate, and partly because their military schedules made coordination challenging. They decided on a ceremony at the Naval Academy Chapel in Annapolis, a location that honored both of their service commitments. Sarah's parents flew in from Boston, along with her extended family and friends from medical school. Jackson's family came from Montana, including his parents, 2 brothers, and his teenage nephew who idolized his SEAL uncle. Many of their military colleagues and friends attended, including several of the soldiers whose lives Sarah had saved during that crucial mission in Afghanistan. The morning of the wedding, Sarah stood in her bridal suite at the historic inn where they were staying, looking at herself in the mirror. Her wedding dress was elegant but simple, chosen for its classic lines rather than elaborate decoration. Her hair was styled in a soft updo that complemented the pearl earrings that had belonged to her grandmother. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," her mother said as she helped with the final adjustments to Sarah's veil. "I still can't believe this is really happening," Sarah replied. 4 years ago, I was a single surgeon focused entirely on my career. I never imagined I would meet someone like Jackson. Sometimes the best things in life come when we least expect them," her mother observed. "Your father and I are so proud of the woman you've become and the man you've chosen to share your life with." At the chapel, Jackson waited at the altar with his best man, Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, the same soldier whose life Sarah had saved during that first surgery under fire in Afghanistan. Jackson wore his navy dress blue uniform, his chest displaying the ribbons and medals he had earned during his 15 years of service. As the processional music began, Jackson felt his heart rate increase in a way that reminded him of preparing for a dangerous mission. But this nervousness was entirely different. This was the anticipation of beginning the most important mission of his life. Sarah appeared at the back of the chapel, and Jackson felt his breath catch. She was more beautiful than he had ever seen her, but more than that, she radiated a confidence and joy that made everyone in the chapel smile. As she walked down the aisle, Jackson thought about the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. The ceremony was conducted by the Naval Academy chaplain, who had known Jackson for several years. He spoke about the importance of partnership in marriage, especially for couples who served their country in demanding careers. Sarah and Jackson, your love story began in one of the most challenging environments imaginable, the chaplain said. You found each other during a time of crisis, and you chose to stand together when it would have been easier to look out for yourselves alone. That foundation of mutual support and shared courage will serve you well in the years to come. When it came time for their vows, Jackson spoke first. Sarah, when I met you in Afghanistan, I thought you were just another doctor doing her job. I had no idea that you were going to change everything about how I saw my life and my future. You showed me what it means to be truly brave. Not just physically brave, but brave enough to care about someone else more than yourself. I promise to love you, support your dreams, and stand with you through whatever challenges life brings us. Sarah's voice was strong and clear as she spoke her vows. Jackson, you taught me that strength comes not from being fearless, but from doing what's right even when you're afraid. You showed me what it means to lead with both courage and compassion. I promise to be your partner in every sense of the word, to support your service to our country, and to build a life with you that honors both of our commitments to helping others. When the chaplain pronounced them husband and wife, Jackson and Sarah kissed with the enthusiasm of two people who had waited a long time for this moment. The chapel erupted in applause and cheers from their military colleagues, many of whom had witnessed firsthand the bond between this couple. At the reception, held at a waterfront venue overlooking the Chesapeake Bay, the celebration reflected both the joy of the occasion and the military culture that had brought them together. The evening included traditional elements like the cutting of the cake with Jackson's ceremonial sword and the playing of both the Navy hymn and America the Beautiful. Sergeant Williams, now fully recovered from his injuries in Afghanistan, stood to give a toast. I owe my life to both of these people, he said, his voice carrying across the quiet reception hall. Dr. Sarah operated on me under enemy fire, and Commander Jackson held her instruments steady while bullets were flying overhead. That's the kind of partnership they have, and that's the kind of marriage they're going to have. To Sarah and Jackson. As the evening progressed, Sarah and Jackson found themselves surrounded by friends and family who shared stories, offered congratulations, and celebrated this new chapter in their lives. But the most meaningful moment came when they had a few minutes alone on the venue's terrace, looking out over the water. So, Mrs. Jackson, how does it feel to be married to a Pentagon desk officer? Jackson asked with a grin. It feels perfect, Colonel Jackson, though I have to admit, I'm still getting used to the idea that you'll be coming home to me every night. And I'm still getting used to the idea that I want to come home every night. You changed everything for me, Sarah. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sunset over the bay. Both of them were thinking about the road that had led them here, from that desperate battlefield in Afghanistan to this moment of perfect happiness. Jackson, can I tell you something? Sarah said suddenly. Anything. I'm not worried about our future anymore. I know we'll face challenges, and I know our careers will continue to be demanding. But I'm not worried because I know we can handle anything together. Jackson pulled her closer. You know what I realized during the ceremony today? What? The chaplain was right about us finding each other during a crisis. But I think we didn't just find each other that day in Afghanistan. I think we found who we were meant to be, both individually and together. As their wedding guests continued to celebrate inside, Sarah and Jackson stood together on the terrace, two people who had proven that love could grow and flourish even in the most unlikely circumstances. They had saved each other's lives in Afghanistan, but more than that, they had saved each other's hearts. Their story had begun with Sarah rescuing a wounded SEAL commander under fire, but it had become something much greater. It had become a testament to the power of love, commitment, and the courage to build a life together despite the challenges that duty and service could bring. Looking ahead to their future, both Sarah and Jackson knew they would continue to serve their country in their respective capacities. Sarah would keep saving lives as a trauma surgeon, and Jackson would continue his military career in his new role. But now they would face whatever came next as partners, united by a bond forged in the crucible of combat and strengthened by years of separation that had only made them more certain of their love. As they finally rejoined their wedding reception, Sarah and Jackson were surrounded by the warmth and support of the military community that had brought them together. Their love story had become legend among their colleagues, proof that even in the darkest and most dangerous circumstances, it was possible to find light, hope, and the person you were meant to spend your life with. The evening ended with Sarah and Jackson driving away from their reception toward their honeymoon destination, but both of them knew that the real adventure was just beginning. They had waited years for this moment, and now they finally had the chance to discover what their love could become when they no longer had to say goodbye.